Emma Waters, Senior Research Associate in the DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family at the Heritage Foundation, has written about and studied surrogacy. Thank you so much for joining us, Emma. Data on the health risks and for surrogates and for the babies is much more prevalent. A C-section is 3 times more likely with surrogate pregnancies, and surrogate babies are 5 times more likely to be delivered at an earlier gestational age than non-surrogate babies. And of course, preeclampsia, hemorrhage, and miscarriage are higher for surrogate pregnancies. How can doctors justify supporting this or rectify their support for this?
Yeah, this is a classic example of, once again, a driving ideology, the right to a child or a desire for a child, overruling even what we know of medical outcomes when it comes to the well-being of the surrogate mothers involved and the well-being of the children involved. Something that most people overlook is that surrogacy, as it's commonly practiced in the United States, requires the use of in vitro fertilization. And so even in vitro fertilization, we know that children born from this practice have higher rates of cancer, autism, congenital heart failure, and other issues that really do affect the quality and well-being of their life. And for the mothers involved, they are 5 times more likely to actually perish as a result of the pregnancy or of the labor and delivery. So it's really bizarre to justify this practice when we know that medically, the women and the children are the ones who are paying the price for others to have the child that they desire.
Now, Emma, you talked about the physical medical realities, but in your research, you also have discussed the medical psychological impacts of surrogacy on the mother. Is this similar to the trauma of a miscarriage? And have you found any impacts that are psychologically significant for the surrogate children themselves?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And I would say for the surrogate mothers, by and large, of the women who have spoken out about this, what they report is something far worse than a miscarriage. So in a miscarriage, it is the tragic loss of a child. But in most cases, women know that they did everything they could to protect this child and keep the child as long as they could. In surrogacy, it's completely different. In many cases, I've spoken to surrogate mothers who go through the pregnancy excited to help a family in need. And yet when the delivery comes and the baby is taken away, oftentimes before they've even had a chance to hold the baby and meet the baby, they experience this just crippling sense of loss. And in many cases, postpartum depression skyrockets. And some have said that not a single day passes, even years later, where they don't think about this child and wonder how he or she is doing, what their parents are like, and if he's safe and okay. And for the child involved, that surrogate mother, even if she's not the biological mother of the child, that surrogate is the only mother that this child has ever known. He's learned the sound of her voice, the taste of her amniotic fluid that actually corresponds with her breast milk, and knows the environment that he's in. So when that child is taken away from the surrogate mother, even if he's placed in the hands of his biological parents, he's placed in the hands of strangers. And so when it comes to the psychological well-being of children, the best that we can say is that we really don't know what we don't know, because only one longitudinal study has been done to actually assess the psychological well-being of children, and it's filled with so many methodological errors that it shouldn't be something that we rely on. And yet the state of New York, the state of Michigan, and countless others have actually cited this single study that was only based on 42 children to say that surrogacy confers no harms to children. But that's just not the case, especially when we know that children born from anonymous egg and sperm donation, or children who suffer the loss of their parents through adoption, do have these crippling identity issues, much like Olivia mentioned. And so to say that surrogacy has no harm really overlooks, I think, all of the data we have on child well-being.
Well, you just mentioned what's going on in the United States. Why is this so heavily regulated throughout Europe, but not in the U.S.? Is there any history there that is not well known about that trajectory of really starting to get protective and walking away from surrogacy in the European Union, as you know, conversely, we're doing the opposite here in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on here. The first is that in the United States, many women who are serving as surrogates are from the middle class. So while there is a perverse financial incentive for surrogates, they're oftentimes women who are not typically very poor and are oftentimes not minority women. In Europe, on the other hand, the surrogacy class, the women who serve as surrogates, are oftentimes from very poor villages in Ukraine, Georgia, and other impoverished areas who may or may not even know how to read, not know the quality of the contract that they're signing. And so I think a lot of Europeans have really risen up against this practice because it does exploit some of the most vulnerable women in all of Europe. And secondly, for better or for worse, the feminist movement has been very opposed to surrogacy. And so in Europe, the way feminism guides the policies that they put in place has actually been a far more powerful force than we've even seen in the United States, such that you have many leaders on the basis of their feminist values, their desire to support women, actually outright oppose the practice of surrogacy, again, because of the way that it really does take advantage of and exploit these vulnerable women.
Right. You've seen pro-abortion advocates in Europe who are anti-surrogacy. Well, let's turn this in a slightly different direction. Let's listen to more of what Jennifer Lal, who we just heard in the package previous to this conversation, what she had to say about the business of surrogacy.
The global market is in the billions of dollars, and it's a growth market, so it's trending up. It's predicted to be in the multi-billion dollars by 2025. It's a standard the rich can buy, and it's the poor or the lower income that have to sell. Surrogacy is very expensive. A take-home baby can be a six-figure baby by U.S. dollars standard.
Big money means big power. How can you combat that kind of influence?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I think the three things to keep in mind here is, one, we need to have a targeted approach here in the United States that actually taps into the ethos of Americans, which is distinct from our European partners. So the first is to make it clear for Christians of all traditions that surrogacy necessarily violates the unified bond of marriage between one man and one woman by bringing a third woman into that marriage. Even if the man is no longer directly having intercourse with her in order to have a child, they still are bringing a third woman into that unified bond of marriage, sex, and procreation in a way that violates both what the Bible says about marriage, but also what many throughout church history have said. And so I think first and foremost, getting all Christians on board with this beyond just the Catholic Church will be huge. The second is keeping in mind the national security risks. So in the United States, we have probably the biggest international market for surrogacy, bigger than Ukraine, bigger than Georgia. And the number one demographic, and this is coming from the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology, a big fertility organization, the number one demographic coming to the United States for surrogacy are Chinese nationals. And typically, these are Asian men over the age of 42. And when a child is born in the United States, they gain and maintain the full rights of U.S. citizenship through birthright citizenship laws, such that when the child turns 18, the parents, even if they're Chinese nationals, have a direct line to citizenship. And so this is a massive national security concern that is totally unregulated in the United States. And then I think the third to keep in mind is the state of New York didn't actually legalize commercial surrogacy in 2021. And the reason they did this was because they claimed they couldn't find any women who were willing to serve as a surrogate altruistically or as a surrogate for free, right, out of the kindness of her heart, which tells us that there is a perverse incentive where even if women do have happy feelings associated with the surrogacy, that the majority of women would not consider this practice unless they're getting paid that $20,000 to $70,000 to serve. And so I think that's a really compelling argument to make, that this really isn't about altruism. This is about big business. This is about big money. And if it comes to the well-being of children or financial incentive, liberals and conservatives alike should be able to recognize that there is something far more important here than the amount of money that you're making.
A very serious correlation, and one we have to take into account. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thanks.